Greeting Earthlings! If you follow the channel, you know that we love all things Apollo, and that during our last visit to Steve Jurvetson's amazing space collection, we were given the opportunity to take 2 holy boxes of Apollo electronics to our lab. Oh boy, these are the boxes that brought you voice, data and live TV from the moon and should be early masterpieces of microwave electronics, the blackest of black arts in analog electronics. In the previous episode, we gave an overview of how the complex S-band system worked by transmitting over 3 frequencies: an uplink at 2.1064 GHz using phase modulation, abbreviated PM, a return downlink, locked and shifted in frequency at 2.2875 GHz, also using PM, and a second free-running downlink at 2.2725 GHz using frequency modulation. All 3 links carry complex subcarrier information, allowing ranging, live up data, live down telemetry, live bidirectional voice, live television, and recorded data and voice transmission. Quite a complicated affair. Our ultimate goal is to power back up as much of the system as we can, but before we can even get there, we first need to understand the internals of our 2 holy boxes, the RF power amplifier and the transponder, which we just opened up in the previous episode. In this episode, we will focus on the S-band power amplifier. Ours is quite early, serial number 0006, and is clearly labeled as an engineering test unit, not for flight. The S-band power amplifier was located in the lower bay. It's the lower of the yellow boxes here, the other yellow box being the transponder. That's where all the electronic communication boxes resided. It's just underneath the Apollo guidance computer, and both are below the optical telescope and the sextant that were used to align the inertial measurement platform against the stars. Here is an overview diagram of the S-band transmission system. The S-band amplifier is the box colored in yellow. It sits between the transponder in blue and the many S-band antennas in tan. You guessed that its main role is to amplify the transmitted signal generated from the transponder from a few hundred milliwatts to the staggering power of 11.6 watts. Yes, you heard right, 11.6 watts, that's all you got to talk from the moon. The box in pink on the right generates all the subcarriers. Like everything else Apollo, it's quite complicated, but we'll ignore it for now. The heart of the amplifier are the 2 traveling wave tubes. These are the microwave amplifiers, and they are very special vacuum tubes. We will come back to it later. There are also several microwave switches on either side of the tubes. They are used to manage redundancy. Finally, there is a triplexer at the output leading to the antenna. The triplexer will combine or split our 3 main signals depending on their frequency, a little bit like a prism would do for light. Let's look at our uplink signal first. It comes from Earth, received by one of the antennas, goes through the triplexer and is kicked off through the 2.1064 GHz port, goes into one of the 2 transponder receivers, and out comes Houston's voice and data to the spaceship.
Hello, Apollo 11, Houston, over.
To which the astronauts will respond using the PM downlink, using one of the 2 PM transmitters in the transponder. The 400 milliwatt they generate is amplified through the TWT number 1 up to 5 watts in low power mode or 20 watts in high power mode, and is then sent to the antenna via the triplexer. By the time it reaches the antenna, due to the cabling, triplexer and connector losses, it is down to 2.8 watts in low power mode or the 11.6 watts in higher power mode we talked about previously.
Roger, we're reading you 5-by. Go ahead, over. Roger, we have you on high gain now.
If you want to transmit TV, dump recorded voice and data or recorded scientific data from the SIM bay instruments, you turn on the FM downlink. It gets amplified by TWT2, is muxed in by the triplexer, and off to Houston it goes.
Oh, Apollo 11, Houston, we got the network all configured for the TV. You can start anytime you want, over.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
11, Houston, the definition is pretty good on our monitor here. The color's not too varsity, at least on this set. Could you describe what you're looking at, over? It's getting a lot better now, 11. Mike, you coming in 5 by. I got a good...
Well, I put on a code and tie if I'd known about this ahead of time.
Note that there are two panel control switches for the astronauts to control the amplifier. The right one is self-explanatory, high or low power mode. The left button, marked primary and secondary, as well as the middle position of the right button, deal with the three redundancy modes. They act on 6 RF relay switches which reshuffle the inside of the amp in case one of the two TWT tubes, or, God forbid, both of the TWT tubes suffer a failure. So by now the 4 RF connectors coming out of the amp should start to make sense. One is the triplexer output to the S-band antenna complex. One is the 2.1064 gig port of the triplexer, which extracted the uplink signal for the transponder receiver. The two others are the PM and FM inputs to the amplifier coming from the transponder. By the way, these connectors are TNCs, the threaded cousins of the bayonet BNCs. When we first opened up the amplifier, I expected to see the traveling wave tubes, but instead we saw a maze of coax cables and a prominent danger high voltage box. At first I thought the TWT tubes would be hiding inside the high voltage box, but it turns out that's not the case. The coax connections to the TNCs revealed that the high voltage box was in fact the triplexer. It has no really high voltage inside and is purely made of passive filtering components. But you can see some yellowish transformers above the triplexer, and this is where the real high voltage danger actually is. These must be the transformers for generating the many kilovolts necessary for the traveling wave tube anodes. And by now you must have been asking yourself, what the heck's going on with this whole bunch of coaxes going in all directions here? And my guess is that it has to do with the redundancy switches. And on this schematic here, it's sort of explained. So this is our amplifier box with the two transponder transmitting frequencies coming on this side. The traveling wave tubes are over here. That's TWT1, TWT2, and the triplexer is over here. So it goes to the antenna over there and goes to the receiver over here. And you can see that normally the PM would go straight through TWT1 and straight into the triplexer, and the FM would do the same. But there are a whole bunch of relays, and actually those are not relays, those must be RF switches. And what they allow to do is to rewire, to swap the tubes if one were to fail. If TWT1 fails, you can switch this relay on and get the PM signal to go down here through TWT2, and now you cannot come out here because it's at the wrong frequency, it's at the FM frequency, so you have to rewire it up there to go in the triplexer PM frequency. And similarly, when you do that, then the FM is swapped over here. But the FM was less important than the PM, so really the goal here was to provide an alternate path for the PM if the TWT1 would fail. And by the way, this one kicks in when you flip the switch that's called secondary primary. Wait, where is Waldo? It's this switch right here. But there are two other relays here, and these kick in when the amplifier is off. And at this point, the PM goes, it goes to pass through, it goes around the whole darn thing and goes straight in the PM port of the triplexer out to the antenna, so that in case your amplifier totally doesn't work at all, then you can transmit solely on the power that comes out of the transponder, which is just a few hundred of milliwatts. And guess what? Did they use that? Yes, they did. For Apollo 13, right? They wanted to conserve power, so they turned off the amplifier, and they were doing backup voice straight out without any amplification, and actually you can hear it. I managed to find the exact place in the Apollo 13 recording where Cy Liebergott suddenly realizes he can turn the amplifier completely off and yet keep voice and data going. Note that they also switched to low data rate, which gives them more margin on the weak signal, and backup voice, which is a similar higher margin mode for voice. They lucked out a bit since at that time they were receiving through the giant Goldstone 210-foot antenna, so it worked out okay on the weak signal. Here is the aha moment, mission elapsed time 57 hours 20 minutes.
Righty, yeah. If we can get low bit rate with the power amp off, let's turn the primary power amp off in time. There's no concern.
Think so? Can we do that?
Yes, that's right.
CSM power amp off.
Low bit rate, down voice backup.
Him to do that?
Yes.
Okay, Capcom. Low bit rate, down voice backup, and power amp off of the CSM.
Okay. Intel, we can make number one.
Odyssey Houston, we'd like you to, on your comm configuration,
Quiet, tell me. Go.
Go to primary power amp off,
Yes.
low bit rate, and down voice backup, over.
Houston, I've gone to primary power amplifier off, low bit rate, down voice backup.
Okay.
Okay, Jack, thank you. And Aquarius, your arithmetic looks good on the course line there.
So my guess is all the coax wire that we see is providing the signal to those switches. And by the way, this is, I have a few RF relay switches in my collection. This is a 1 to 2, so goes either here or there. This is a 1 to many. And the one that's in the schematic is a switch, is a 2 to 2. So this one, my bet is that it's one relay with 2 inputs, 2 outputs. Same here. Here you have a switch that's 2 inputs, 1 output, so 3 connections, and here's one with 3 connections. And actually, if you go look at the amplifier, you will see that it sort of matches. We see 4 boxes, and my bet is that those are the microwave relays, the microwave switches. 2 of them only have 3 connections, and that tells me these are the bypass ones, and 2 of them have 4 connections, and that tells me this is probably the one that swapped the traveling wave tubes. And to figure it out, there's only one way to know, is to open up the boxes further. But it's going to be a bit of a challenge to open this thing up, because apparently this thing is constructed from the bottom up. And you can see from my screwdrivers, they are screws all the way down, so I had to reach for the super long screwdriver. And they are super extra tight, of course, it's vibration proof. And there are some at high level, there's a medium level where there are some screws, and there's a down level. And you can tell you were probably supposed to put some handles over here and get some of the bottom screws off. Actually, it's both the bottom and the middle one, because this one's attached to the casting too. And then pull this whole thing. Over here, this is not attached, this is just held by the million coaxes that are going to it. And I suspect down there somewhere is probably where our traveling wave tubes are. I can see some coaxes going down to the bowl of the thing. And by the way, you see that all the coax connectors, they have this goop on it. It's fairly soft. It looks like it's some kind of hot glue. And that is done, of course, because you can never tighten your RF connectors very tight. And so in order for them to not move, they put that hot glue around them. But it's fairly easy and innocuous to remove and easy to redo. So the challenge will be try to get as far in as we can and disconnecting as little as we possibly can, if that's even possible. So I was able to slowly remove all the accessible screws without dropping any, taping them on a map of the amp so I could put them back at the right place, and that was enough to get the triplexer block loose, but there were still hidden screws holding the relays, and to get to them I had to start disconnecting some of the tightest coax cable so I could lift the connector plate. And I was finally rewarded by my first sight of the traveling wave tube. I think it's here, the long black cylinder all the way at the bottom. And here I point to it with my screwdriver. I can also spy the second tube right above it, but at this point it is inaccessible. I'll have to remove the relays first. Here on the side, the silvery cylinders are RF attenuators. They are added to prevent back reflections from the triplexer to make their way back into the PM transmitter, as that would easily cause phase noise, which is a bad thing on a phase modulated transmitter. And here I point at the ports of the triplexer. I was able to identify which was which from the coax cabling. But back to my connector plate here, it looks like to go any further I would have to disconnect all of the RF cables, which is a whole lot, and also make sure to put them back together at the correct place. So at that point that seemed to be a lot of error-prone work, and we were discussing with Mike what would be the best way forward. And then we had a scary incident. I realized that when we opened one of the RF connectors, the center pin of the male connector had remained lodged in the female connector. I was afraid it had broken, which really should not happen at all when you disconnect these. But when I recovered the pin, it was absolutely intact, not broken, complete with the soldering nib at the other end, but with no solder on it. When we looked at the coax end, it was also intact with its pre-tinned nib. It looks like the two were really never soldered together. Maybe some kind of oversight? That gave Mike a great excuse to show off his genuine Apollo electrical installation manual, which has all the exacting procedures on how to cable the spacecraft. The coax are obviously some of the most challenging assemblies and have a chapter of their own, exhorting the technicians to use as much care as a surgeon would do. So it looks like we need to do a little bit of our own corrective surgery here, fitting that I held the cable with surgical forceps. Fortunately, because the parts were essentially already prepared, they fit perfectly together, and all I had to do is add the missing solder carefully. So all ended up well, but it made us even more reluctant to remove more coax cabling. Fortunately, I could get by loosening the TNC connectors, which give us sufficient access to have a good look at what we thought were the relays. Note that I put little number labels on everything, so I would be able to reconnect everything in the correct order afterwards. And yes, it's confirmed they are indeed RF switches made right here in California. Getting a good glimpse at the TWT tubes was more difficult. Removing them would have meant ungluing neatly laid control wire harnesses, so we contented ourselves with this picture, which clearly shows it's the TWT. I could not see the manufacturer of the tube, but Ken thinks it looks like one made by RCA, which would make sense as RCA was the first vendor to make a TWT for space use in 1962. Mike was able to find a Collins document that has a picture of the innards of the amplifier taken out of the box. You can see the long TWT on the side of the assembly. Note that to take this picture, they had to assemble the amplifier on a special flat holder plate without walls. So it would have been something very difficult for us to do anyhow if we had been able to take the innards out of the box. But here you can see it in its full black and white glory. For those who are still following along in this very long video, I thought I would explain how a traveling wave tube works, as this is an important device still used in satellites today. This tube was invented independently by Rudolf Kampfner in a secret British radar lab and Niels Lindenblad of RCA in 1942. Rudy Kampfner is credited with refining the traveling wave tube for practical use after he joined Bell Labs in the 1950s. Quite significantly, he also demonstrated the first use of traveling wave tubes for space communications. It happened in 1962 with the launch of Bell Labs' Telstar 1 satellite. This was the first active telecommunication satellite and transmitted live TV over the Atlantic for the first time ever. The Telstar used a TWT built by RCA and had a power of 2 watts. It looks like the 20-watt TWT we have in the Apollo amplifier is a descendant of the Telstar 1 just a few short years later. The traveling wave tube is a vacuum electron tube, all right. It has a filament heating a cathode, which emits electrons, which are then focused and accelerated to about 20% of the speed of light by a positive anode. The electron beam then travels through a long tube. Since the beam is made of negatively charged electrons, they tend to repulse each other, and if you did nothing, they'll just diverge very quickly. To keep them in a nice beam, you put a bunch of magnets around the tube. It keeps them focused, just as in a particle accelerator. Now that you have a nice energetic beam, you apply the RF field at the input of a conductive tungsten wire that coils around the beam. Counterintuitively, our purple RF wave travels close to the speed of light in the wire, way faster than our blue electrons in the vacuum. Think of it like a sound wave. The sound wave travels at the speed of sound in air, although the air is still. This is just like our electrical wave in the wire. But it would take a super strong wind to move the air molecules themselves at any close to the speed of sound, just like it is very hard to accelerate our electrons close to the speed of light in the vacuum. And there is the genius of the traveling wave tube. The coil is calculated so that the forward speed of the wave is slowed down to exactly match the speed of the electrons in the beam. This is simply because the RF wave has to take the long way around the coil, whereas the electron beams go straight. As a result, the RF electric field travels along with the electrons and bunches them together. In turn, the electron bunches also induce a field in our wire and amplify the RF wave. What we have done is steal kinetic energy from the electron beam and couple it back into our RF wave. If you do it perfectly right, you can get large amounts of RF power at the output of the tube. This is surprisingly efficient and still beats solid-state electronics today, which I was very surprised of. Just today, while I was editing this video, I went to a space communication conference, and there were several companies showing their traveling wave tubes. This modern one puts out 600 watts, way more than the 20 watts in our amplifier, but is still the same principle as our Apollo tube. So the traveling wave tube is truly the device that enables space communications and is still used to this day in modern satellites. There are 3 in Voyager 1 still talking to us from outside the solar system, and they will also be used on the James Webb Telescope soon to be launched. You'll be relieved to know that I reassembled the amplifier without losing a single screw or a washer, making good use of my long screwdrivers, my surgical instruments, and a handy-dandy magnet on a stick. However, powering up the amp will be problematic, even though the S-band is one of the rare bands where you are allowed to use dollops of focused kilowattish power if you are licensed. We'd rather not play with 11 watts of S-band signal, even hunkered in my basement. I don't want to start seeing satellites fall in my backyard, or worse, irritate the FCC. We should still be able to do some tests with a load, transmit microscopic amounts of signals through very high attenuators. I might also be able to measure and use the antenna triplexer with the unpowered amp in pass-through mode a la Apollo 13. But I would have to wait for a future episode. See you there!